Okay, so now we're hopping into the notes. Everybody should be open to page 45, which is the page that we already kind of pointed out, but this is our introduction to slope notes. So, after you watch Slope Dude, hopefully that helped you understand that when you see a line moving in this direction, it is going to have a positive slope, puff, puff, positive. When you have a line moving down, it is going to have a negative slope, nice negative. When you have a flat line or a horizontal line, it is going to have a slope of 0. And when you have a vertical line going up and down, you have a slope of undefined. So please make sure you write this information down. The way I remembered undefined is you're falling off of a cliff if you're slope dudes, so your life is kind of undefined. You didn't make it very far. But one thing I recommend is on the top of your homework, the top of your test, you draw this picture. So I would actually draw a little mountain peak, a flat line, and a vertical line with positive, negative, 0, and a U to represent undefined. Okay, so before we move down and actually talk about this part, I want us to understand that slope is the steepness of a line. So we're going to write that. Slope is the steepness of a line. So we're figuring out, is it really steep to where it's almost vertical? Is it flat? Is it maybe less steep? I don't know. That's what we're figuring out though, okay? So first let's look at positive and negative sloping lines. I want you to look at just the positive lines first. And I want you to take a second and see if you notice anything. You can pause the video if you need to. Okay, so hopefully, if you actually thought about it, hopefully you would have noticed that all of your lines are pointing up and right in every single one of these examples. Up and right, up and right, up and right, up and right. The reason that's important is because just like puff, puff, positive, they all are going to point up and right. Another thing that I want you to also notice is that the number in front of x is always positive, and that's because that is your slope. What is the number in front of the x on the bottom left equation? It is a 1, which also is a positive number, a positive slope. So what we're going to write in the what do you notice section is we are going to write, whoa, got some weirdness going on here. We are going to write that they always point up and right. And then we're also going to write that the number before x is positive in the equation. Okay, so pause the video if you need to finish writing that. So now let's look at negative. So negative slope, again, I want you to look at these equations and see, or these equations and the graphs, and see if you notice anything about them. You can pause the video if you need to. So negative sloping lines, that was supposed to be a, there we go. Negative sloping lines, you'll notice always go down. So I always look at my graphs from left to right. I don't know if you've noticed that. But these lines for negative go down and right. We also should have noticed that the number in front of x is always negative now. Again, asking you the question in the first equation, what is your number before x? It is a 1, but in this case, it is a negative 1 because it's a negative slope. So what do we notice? That our graphs always point down and right, because remember, we look at it left to right. And the number before x, oh, geez. Is always negative for negative sloped lines. Pause it if you need to write that, and we're going to go ahead and move on to the two last ones in our slope dude chart. So the last two, excuse me, the last two that we learned about from slope dude are 0 and undefined. These ones are pretty cool because it's literally telling you what your slope equals. In the positive and negative, we're going to learn here in a second how to actually solve for it. But for these, you don't have to. The slope of a horizontal line, so I'm going to write here, these ones are horizontal, and these ones are vertical. And the slope here is always 0. The slope here is always undefined. We actually write that word out. So looking at your equations and your graphs, let's look at just the 0 lines first. And hopefully we notice, like we kind of already mentioned, that your lines are, oh my Lanta, bear with me. Your lines are always horizontal with a 0 slope, okay? And you'll notice that your equations are always y equals a number equations. And that's because it is crossing the y-axis. So if you look at the bottom left equation, it's crossing right here on the y-axis at y equals -1. So now looking at the undefined lines, we already mentioned that they're always vertical, so we're going to write that. Remember, he fell off the cliff. His life is undefined. And then the equations are going to always be x equals a number. Similar to what we just talked about, let's look at the bottom left equation. And this line in our graph is actually crossing at x equals -3, which is why that is the equation. Pause if you need to. I'm going to move on down. Whoa. Okay, so we have this lovely formula. We kind of talked about this formula last class. It was just mentioned that this is the most common formula you're going to use in algebra. It is slope-intercept form. So I hope you're writing this down. That's what it's called. And we're going to label it because this is what we're going to use the rest of the unit. So y, that actually is just y. It's just like your y coordinate from your ordered pair. There's nothing special we have to write about it. M, this is your slope. So we already pointed out that your slope's always in front of x. The variable for slope is m, and I don't know why. We can Google it later if we have time. But that's how we'll always represent our slope, is with that letter m. This variable x, that's just x, like the x coordinate from your ordered pair. And this last one is your y-intercept. We are going to be learning about that later in another video as well. So please make sure you write those down, and you can go ahead and take a little break if you need to, a little breather, and then move on to the next video when you're ready.